That Canadian guy in hog pen is 8th on mediums. The qualification session is at Virginia International Raceway in Alton, Virginia, USA. Wiremu is first on mediums. Chris Butt from New Zealand in Horseshoe is P6 on mediums. The Race Dictator from New Zealand is P3 on mediums. Todd from New Zealand in Horseshoe is 7th on mediums. That Canadian guy from Canada in back straight is P2 on mediums. Johnny Prince from New Zealand in back straight is P6 on mediums. Wiremu is P1. Wiremu is up 8.86 in left hook. Wiremu is up 9.04 in South Bend. Wiremu is up 8.28 in roller coaster. Wiremu improved his first with a 147.962. The Race Dictator is third on mediums. The Race Dictator improved his second with a 148.001. .039 off pole. Dave B. Racing from South Africa is P4 on mediums. Dave B. Racing improved his fourth with a 153.679. 5.717 off pole. Chris Butt is P4. Johnny Prince is P6 up 0.97. Wyremu in back straight is first up 0.28. 5 minutes remaining in the session. Wyremu is up 0.16 in hot pen. The race dictator is P2 up 0.37. The race dictator is provisional pole with a 147.799. Dave B Racing is P6 up 3.67. Dave B Racing improved is P4 with a 148.819. 1.020 off pole. Johnny Prince is P7. Johnny Prince improved is P7 with a 152.144. 4.345 off pole. Todd is 5th up 0.11. That Canadian guy in South Bend is 3rd up 0.51. Wyremu in back straight is P2 up 0.37. Wyremu is up 0.26 in hot pen. Wyremu is provisional pole with a 147.694. That Canadian guy is provisional pole with a 147.597. The race dictator is provisional pole with a 147.370. Wyremu is up 0.02 in NASCAR Bend. Johnny Prince in hog pen is 7th up 1.15. Johnny Prince improved is 7th with a 150.647. 3.277 off pole. Todd is 5th up 1.16. Todd improved is P5 with a 148.032. 0.662 off pole. Chris Butt in left hook is P6 up 0.14. That Canadian guy in back straight is 2nd up 0.14. That Canadian guy is up 0.35 in hog pen. That Canadian guy is provisional pole with a 147.134. Chris Butt in back straight is P6 up 1.16. Chris Butt improved is 6th with a 148.872. 1.738 off pole. The qualifying session is now in overtime. Wyremew is P4. Wyremew is up 0.55 in Oak Tree. Dave B. Racing from South Africa is P3 up 0.29. Wyremew in roller coaster is P4 up 0.32. The race dictator from New Zealand in Oak Tree is second. Best lap is a 147.370. 0.236 off pole. The race dictator is up 0.18 in roller coaster. Johnny Prince is 7th up 0.33. Broadcast bot is P20. The race session is at Virginia International Raceway in Alton, Virginia, USA. That Canadian guy is P1. The race dictator from New Zealand is P2 on mediums. Race start. Wyremew in horseshoe is P2 on mediums. The race dictator in left hook is third. The race dictator passed Wyremew for second. Wyremew is P3. The race dictator is second. Wyremew in back straight is P3. The race dictator in roller coaster is P2. Wyremew is P3. The race dictator in horseshoe is second, 0.4 ahead of Wyremew. Wyremew is P3 on mediums, 0.5 behind the race dictator. The race dictator from New Zealand is second, 0.6 behind that Canadian guy. Wiremu on lap 2 is P3, 1.0 behind the race dictator. The race dictator in back straight is second, 0.4 behind that Canadian guy. Wiremu in roller coaster is third, 0.5 behind the race dictator. Wiremu is now P2. Chris Butt from New Zealand in hog pen is fifth on mediums, 0.9 behind that Canadian guy. Chris Butt passed that Canadian guy for P4. Wiremu is second, 0.6 behind the race dictator. 20 minutes remaining in the session. Dave B. Racing from South Africa is third on mediums, 0.2 ahead of Chris Butt. Chris Butt was 10.6 faster last lap. Wiremu in horseshoe is P2, 0.3 ahead of Dave B. Racing. Dave B. Racing in NASCAR Bend on lap 3 is third, 0.4 ahead of that Canadian guy. Wiremu in Snake is P2, 0.2 ahead of Dave B. Racing. Dave B. Racing in South Bend is third, 0.2 ahead of that Canadian guy. Wiremu in back straight is P2, 0.6 behind the race dictator. Dave B. Racing in back straight is P5, 0.2 behind that Canadian guy. Dave B. Racing was 3.1 faster last lap. Wiremu in hog pen is second, 0.5 behind the race dictator. Johnny Prince from New Zealand is sixth on mediums, 0.7 behind Chris Butt. Wiremu in NASCAR Bend is P2, 0.4 behind the race dictator. Johnny Prince in NASCAR Bend is sixth, 0.9 behind Chris Butt. Wiremu is second, 0.5 behind the race dictator. Johnny Prince in South Bend is sixth, 0.8 behind Chris Butt. Johnny Prince was 3.1 faster last lap. Wiremu in back straight is P2, 0.7 behind the race dictator. Johnny Prince in back straight is P6, 0.5 behind Chris Budd. Wiremu is P2, 0.6 behind the race dictator. Chris Budd from New Zealand in Horseshoe is P5, 2.8 behind Dave B Racing. Wiremu in Snake is second on mediums, 0.7 behind the race dictator. That Canadian guy from Canada is sixth on mediums, 1.7 behind Chris Budd. "15 minutes remaining in the session. Wiremu in back straight is second on mediums, 0.5 behind the race dictator. That Canadian guy in back straight is P6, 1.5 behind Chris Budd. That Canadian guy was 1.5 faster last lap. Dave B Racing is fourth. Best lap is a 1:48.317. 1.222 off the fastest lap. That Canadian guy is sixth, 0.1 behind Chris Budd. Wiremu is P4, 0.2 behind Dave B Racing. That Canadian guy in Snake is P6, 0.4 behind Chris Budd. That Canadian guy passed Chris Budd for P5. That Canadian guy lost fifth to Chris Budd. Wiremu on lap 6 is P4, 0.5 behind Dave B Racing. That Canadian guy in back straight is sixth, 0.7 behind Chris Budd. Wiremu in roller coaster is fourth, 0.4 behind Dave B Racing. That Canadian guy is sixth, 0.5 behind Chris Budd. Wiremu in Horseshoe is fourth, 0.5 behind Dave B Racing. That Canadian guy is P6, 0.5 behind Chris Budd. Wiremu is P4, 1.0 behind Dave B Racing. Chris Butt on lap 7 is 6th, 1.8 behind that Canadian guy. Wyremew in back straight is 4th. Best lap is a 1:47.118. 0.023 off the fastest lap. Dave B Racing in Hogpen is 3rd, 0.7 ahead of Wyremew. Wyremew is 4th, 0.9 behind Dave B Racing. Dave B Racing from South Africa in NASCAR Bend is P3, 3.4 ahead of Wyremew. Ten minutes remaining in the session. Johnny Prince is 7th. That Canadian guy is 5th, 0.6 behind Wyremew. Wyremew was 1.2 faster last lap. The race dictator is P1, 1.2 ahead of Todd. That Canadian guy on lap 8 is 5th, 1.6 ahead of Chris Butt. Todd from New Zealand is 2nd on mediums. Best lap is a 1:48.170. 1.339 off the fastest lap. Dave B Racing is 3rd, 0.3 ahead of Wyremew. Todd in Oak Tree is P2 battling the race dictator. Todd passed the race dictator for P1. Dave B Racing in back straight is P3, 0.4 behind Todd. Todd in back straight is P2, 0.1 ahead of Wyremew. That Canadian guy from Canada is 3rd, 0.8 behind Todd. Todd is P2, 0.6 behind the race dictator. That Canadian guy is 3rd, 0.8 behind Todd. That Canadian guy was 12.2 faster last lap. Todd is 2nd, 0.7 behind the race dictator. Todd was 9.3 faster last lap. That Canadian guy is P3, 0.4 behind Todd. Todd from New Zealand in Oak Tree is P2, 0.6 ahead of that Canadian guy. That Canadian guy in back straight is P3, 0.8 behind Todd. The race dictator is second, 0.1 behind Todd. The race dictator lost second to that Canadian guy. That Canadian guy is P2, 0.8 behind Todd. The race dictator in horseshoe is third, 1.0 behind that Canadian guy. 5 minutes remaining in the session. That Canadian guy in left hook is P2, 0.6 behind Todd. Dave B racing in snake is fifth. Best lap is a 147.070. 0.239 off the fastest lap. That Canadian guy is P2, 0.6 behind Todd. Dave B racing from South Africa in back straight is P5, 0.7 behind Wiremute. That Canadian guy in roller coaster is P2, 0.5 behind Todd. Dave B racing in hog pen is P5, 0.8 behind Wiremute. The race dictator in NASCAR bend is third, 0.7 behind that Canadian guy. That Canadian guy is second, 0.3 behind Todd. The race dictator in South Bend is third, 0.6 behind that Canadian guy. Wiremute in Oak Tree is fifth. That Canadian guy in roller coaster is P2 on mediums, 0.4 behind Todd. That Canadian guy lost second to the race dictator. The race dictator from New Zealand is P2, 0.5 ahead of that Canadian guy. That Canadian guy in horseshoe is third, 0.6 behind the race dictator. The race dictator is P2, 0.6 behind Todd. That Canadian guy is third, 1.2 behind the race dictator. The race dictator in Oak Tree is P2, 0.8 behind Todd. Wiremew is 5th, 1.0 behind that Canadian guy. The race dictator is P2. Best lap is a 1:46.831. The leader has just finished the race. Todd finished P1. The race dictator finished second. Dave B Racing finished P3. Wiremew finished 4th. That Canadian guy finished P5. Johnny Prince finished P6. Chris Butt is 7th. Chris Butt finished 7th. Broadcast bot is 8th. The race session is at Virginia International Raceway in Alton, Virginia, USA. Chris Butt from New Zealand is first on mediums. Race start. Wiremew in Horseshoe is third on mediums. That Canadian guy from Canada is second on mediums. That Canadian guy is now second. Chris Butt in Snake is P2. That Canadian guy in South Bend is third. Dave B Racing from South Africa in back straight is P4 on mediums. Johnny Prince from New Zealand in back straight is P6 on mediums. Dave B Racing is P3. That Canadian guy entering the pits is P1. Dave B Racing is now third. The race dictator from New Zealand is P5 on mediums, 1.7 behind Dave B Racing. The race dictator is now P4. Dave B Racing in Horseshoe is fourth, 0.3 behind the race dictator. Bray entering the pits is P8. The race dictator entering the pits is third. Todd from New Zealand in Horseshoe is sixth on mediums, 0.9 behind Chris Butt. Dave B Racing entering the pits is second. Todd passed Chris Butt for fifth. The race session is at Virginia International Raceway in Alton, Virginia, USA. Todd from New Zealand is P1 on mediums. Race start. Todd is now P8. Chris Butt from New Zealand in Horseshoe is second on mediums. Bray from Italy in NASCAR Bend is P3 on mediums. Bray is now P2. Johnny Prince from New Zealand in Snake is P3 on mediums. Wiremew is P4 on mediums. Johnny Prince is P3. The race dictator from New Zealand in back straight is fifth on mediums. Johnny Prince is third. Wiremew is P4. Wiremew is now P3. The race dictator on lap 2 is fourth, 0.3 behind Wiremew. Todd in left hook is fifth, 0.5 behind the race dictator. The race dictator is fourth, 0.5 behind Wiremew. Wiremew in Oak Tree is third, 0.6 behind Bray. The race race dictator in back straight is 4th, 0.4 behind Wiremute. Wiremute in roller coaster is P3 on mediums, 0.5 ahead of the race dictator. The race dictator is 4th, 0.3 ahead of Todd. Bray in horseshoe is P3. Best lap is a 151.714. 4.432 off the fastest lap. 20 minutes remaining in the session. Bray passed Wiremute for P2. The race dictator from New Zealand in left hook is P3, 0.9 ahead of Wiremute. Dave B racing from South Africa in Snake is P5 on mediums, 0.6 ahead of Johnny Prince. The race dictator is P3, 0.6 ahead of Todd. Bray is second, 0.4 behind that Canadian guy. The race dictator in Oak Tree on lap 3 is P3 battling Todd. Bray in back straight is second, 0.6 ahead of the race dictator. The race dictator was 1.4 faster last lap. The race dictator in roller coaster is P3, 0.4 ahead of Todd. Todd is P3. Best lap is a 148.787. 1.505 off the fastest lap. Wiremute in horseshoe is 4th, 0.3 ahead of Dave B racing. Dave B racing was 2.1 faster last lap. Todd in NASCAR Bend is 3rd, 0.5 behind Bray. Wiremute in Snake is P4, 0.3 behind Bray. Wiremute is now second. Dave B racing is P3, 0.4 ahead of Johnny Prince. Johnny Prince in back straight is 4th, 0.8 behind Dave B racing. Johnny Prince was 1.1 faster last lap. Dave B racing from South Africa in back straight is P3, 0.6 behind Wiremute. Todd in roller coaster is 8th. Dave B racing in horseshoe is P3, 0.3 behind Wiremute. Johnny Prince in NASCAR Bend is P4 on mediums, 0.9 behind Dave B Racing. The Race Dictator in Snake is P4, 0.3 behind Johnny Prince. Dave B Racing is P5, 0.6 behind the Race Dictator. Dave B Racing was 3.2 faster last lap. 15 minutes remaining in the session. Johnny Prince is 4th, 0.2 ahead of Dave B Racing. Dave B Racing was 1.0 faster last lap. Johnny Prince passed the Race Dictator for 3rd. The Race Dictator in back straight on lap 5 is 4th, 0.1 behind Johnny Prince. The Race Dictator passed Johnny Prince for P3. Johnny Prince is P4, 0.3 ahead of Dave B Racing. Dave B Racing on lap 5 is P5, 0.9 behind Johnny Prince. Dave B Racing was 1.0 faster last lap. Johnny Prince is P4 on mediums, 0.6 ahead of Dave B Racing. Dave B Racing in Snake is 5th on mediums, 1.0 behind Johnny Prince. Todd in Left Hook is 8th, 0.5 behind Bray. Bray was 1.9 faster last lap. Dave B Racing in Oak Tree is P5, 0.4 behind Johnny Prince. Todd on lap 6 is P8, 0.8 behind Bray. Dave B Racing is P5, 0.2 behind Johnny Prince. Johnny Prince was 2.5 faster last lap. Dave B Racing is now P4. Bray in Roller Coaster is P8. The Race Dictator on lap 7 is 3rd, 1.1 behind Wiremew. Wiremew in NASCAR Bend is P2, 0.7 ahead of the Race Dictator. The Race Dictator is P3. Best lap is a 147.973. 0.781 off the fastest lap. Todd in Snake is 7th, 0.5 ahead of Bray. Wiremew is 2nd, 0.3 behind That Canadian Guy. That Canadian Guy was 0.8 faster last lap. The Race Dictator is P3, 0.2 ahead of Dave B Racing. Wyremew in back straight is P2 on mediums, 0.5 behind that Canadian guy. Dave B Racing in back straight is P4 on mediums, 0.3 behind the race dictator. Ten minutes remaining in the session. Wyremew in Hogpen is second on mediums, 0.5 behind that Canadian guy. Dave B Racing is P4, 0.6 behind the race dictator. Wyremew in NASCAR Bend is P2, 0.5 behind that Canadian guy. The race dictator in Snake is third on mediums, 0.2 behind Wyremew. The race dictator passed Wyremew for second. Wyremew is P3, 0.3 behind the race dictator. The race dictator was 3.9 faster last lap. The race dictator is second. Dave B Racing in back straight is P4, 0.1 behind Wyremew. Johnny Prince in roller coaster is 7th, 1.0 behind Bray. Dave B Racing is P4, 1.0 behind Wyremew. Johnny Prince in Horseshoe on lap 9 is P7, 1.0 behind Bray. Dave B Racing is P4. Best lap is a 1:48.667. 1.577 off the fastest lap. Wyremew on lap 9 is third, 1.2 behind the race dictator. The race dictator in back straight is second, 1.0 ahead of Wyremew. The race dictator was 2.2 faster last lap. Wyremew in roller coaster is P3, 0.9 behind the race dictator. Wyremew passed the race dictator for P2. Dave B Racing from South Africa in Hogpen is 4th, 0.4 behind the race dictator. The race dictator was 1.6 faster last lap. Johnny Prince on lap 9 is 7th, 0.7 behind Bray. Dave B Racing in NASCAR Bend is P4. Best lap is a 1:48.617. 1.527 off the fastest lap. Johnny Prince on lap 10 is P6, 0.5 behind Bray. Dave B Racing in South Bend is P4, 0.1 behind the race dictator. Bray in Oak Tree is P6, 0.3 behind Johnny Prince. 5 minutes remaining in the session. Dave B Racing in Back Straight is 4th, 0.8 behind the race dictator. The race dictator in Hog Pen is P4, 0.5 behind Dave B Racing. Todd is 6th on mediums, 0.6 behind the race dictator. Todd was 2.8 faster last lap. Todd passed the race dictator for P5. The race dictator from New Zealand in Horseshoe is P6, 0.6 behind Todd. Todd is P5, 0.3 behind Johnny Prince. Todd lost 6th to Chris Budd. The race dictator is 5th, 0.9 behind Johnny Prince. Chris Budd is 6th, 1.3 behind the race dictator. The race dictator from New Zealand in Back Straight is P5, 0.2 behind Johnny Prince. Johnny Prince was 8.0 faster last lap. The race dictator passed Johnny Prince for P4. Johnny Prince is 6th on mediums, 0.7 behind Chris Budd. Chris Budd on lap 11 is 5th, 1.8 behind the race dictator. Bray entering the pits is P7. Dave B Racing in Snake is P3, 2.1 behind Wiremew. Chris Budd is P5, 3.5 behind the race dictator. Dave B Racing in Back Straight is P3, 2.3 behind Wiremew. Wiremew in Hog Pen is P2, 2.4 ahead of Dave B Racing. Dave B Racing is P3 on mediums, 2.4 behind Wiremew. Johnny Prince is P6, 4.0 behind Chris Budd. Dave B Racing is third. Best lap is a 147.687. 0.810 off the fastest lap. Johnny Prince is P6, 3.3 behind Chris Budd. Johnny Prince was 3.6 faster last lap. Dave B Racing in roller coaster is third, 3.4 behind Wiremew. The leader has just finished the race. That Canadian guy from Canada finished first. Wiremew finished P2. Dave B Racing finished P3. The race dictator finished fourth. Chris Budd finished P5. Johnny Prince finished 6th. Todd is P7. Todd finished P7. Broadcast bot is P9.